Well, I'm sorry it took me so long to get this out. I've been finishing a script for a cyberpunk video that ended up being 2 hours long and finally got to the recording phase where I can start producing the video. It's been distracting me. In this video, however, I'll be covering 3 pieces of news: the in-game cinematic released by BioWare earlier this month, the new short story released the same day, and Dreadwolf's lack of appearance at the Game Awards and what that may mean. I don't think that last one means very much, so let me get that one out of the way first. Dragon Age Dreadwolf was a no-show at this year's Video Game Awards, despite many, including myself, feeling all but certain they would be there. We got a hint about this earlier in the week when the dev team said they were closing out the year with the cinematic they released, but I still hoped. So why didn't Dreadwolf show up at the Game Awards? The hot take some people have jumped to is that the game is further behind than we thought and will likely not release until 2024. That thought occurred to me as well, but I've been reconsidering for a few reasons. As several people more knowledgeable about the modern industry than myself have noted, it may be simply because the industry has moved towards shorter marketing cycles before a game's release. I would point out that most of the marketing we've seen from the game recently has not been dedicated marketing material. Concept art, and even this in-game cinematic, was produced as part of the development process, and the short stories are probably the least resource-intensive things they could produce as marketing material. In short, it doesn't seem like BioWare has been putting any serious resources towards marketing lately. My take is that BioWare devs have had their noses to the grindstone this year working to complete the alpha milestone, which they announced last month. Creating demos and even in-game trailers can be surprisingly disruptive to the development process. It means you have to get certain parts of the game highly polished to reflect a release state, instead of focusing on bringing the whole game along closer to that state. So they probably decided to just knuckle down on development instead. Dreadwolf also wasn't the only high-profile game potentially slated for a 2023 release that failed to make an appearance at the Game Awards. Bethesda's Starfield was absent and is supposed to be released in 2023. Hogwarts Legacy similarly failed to appear, and we've learned just recently that it will be released in February 2023, only a few months away. The show also generally seemed to be more weighted towards premieres for unannounced games than anything else. So for all those reasons, I don't think Dreadwolf not being at the Game Awards is very meaningful. I think BioWare is probably still aiming for the late 2023 release, but will delay into 2024 if they encounter difficulties. Let's move on to things that did happen. We'll leave the cinematic to the end, so let's talk about the short story. As We Fly by Lucas Christiansen is the latest short story released by BioWare writers as a treat for the fans on Dragon Age Day 2022. It came out just in time for me to quickly edit new information into my latest lore video. The art is not actually new, however. It was released over a year ago, featuring what are presumably Antivan crows fighting and evading armored guards. That's not quite relevant to the story since they aren't Qunari, but I can see why they would reuse this image if they really are focusing all resources on development. It begins with a chilling proclamation. The Antam will rule Antiva, and Treviso will learn to kneel. This is a major development for the Qunari invasion, which previously had been confined to Tevinter. Treviso is a city in northern Antiva. It means the Qunari have broken the peace treaty they signed with every nation except Tevinter 150 years ago. If you want to know more about that, I did a detailed video about the Qunari not long ago, so please check that out. Anyway, the story follows a brother and sister, Neri and Noah de Acutis. Neri is the brother and Noah the sister. Both are older members of the Antivan Crows. They're leading a group of Kunari soldiers on a chase through the streets of Treviso. Ultimately, they trap and kill a particularly vicious sub-commander of the invasion nicknamed the Lash. This turns out to actually be a distraction to draw out the garrison, however, so that the Crows could attack the Kunari stronghold and destroy many of their weapons, presumably cannons. There are a couple things to note in this story aside from the Kunari invasion in general. First, the Crows mentioned several times that the threats and pronouncement of the Kunari leader of the occupation, the butcher Dathrata, sound half-hearted, like he doesn't really mean it. I want to point that out because some negativity I've seen about this story is that it presents the Kunari as boilerplate evil invaders, and the Lash in particular as a cruel monster. I think there's room even among the Kunari for that kind of character in the ranks of the Antom, so in itself that doesn't bother me. There was a similar character in 3 Trees to Midnight, a short story from the Tevinter Nights book. It might be that the Antom usually requires the influence of the priesthood to keep stuff like that in check, and this invasion appears to be happening without them. However, I think it's interesting that this Butcher character appears to be reluctant or just playing a role. His job is to keep the city pacified for the Kunari, and he's attempting to do so with intimidation, but his heart isn't in it. He also doesn't seem to have shut down the city or forced the people into labor camps. At the end of the story, the Crows are drinking coffee in a cafe, so it seems at least some of the city is still functioning normally. This plays into my idea that taking Antiva isn't really the goal for the Kunari. Rather, Treviso is just a convenience. To the north of Treviso, you find an inland city called Brinlaw and the Arlathan Forest. I want to note that the very first city we know the Kunari attacked was Quarinus, which is the closest Tevinter city to the Arlathan Forest. We know from Trespasser that the Kunari are aware of the Dreadwolf and his plans to some degree. We know that they want to stop him. We know that to some extent this invasion seems to have happened in response to the failure of the Kunari plan in Trespasser. So what I propose is this: what if the true goal of this invasion is to encircle Arlathan Forest, which they believe is crucial to the Dreadwolf's plan in some way? In this context, the continued invasion of Tevinter and taking of additional cities there is essentially just to keep the Magisters off balance and keep them from regrouping to push the Kunari off the mainland. Taking Treviso is mostly about opening up a supply route by sea and allowing the Kunari to access the southern and eastern Arlathan Forest. Maybe the occupation of Treviso seems so light because they don't want to antagonize the other nations of Thedas more than they have to. Maybe the Arishok even sent a message to the Divine saying they would leave once their business was done. I could be off base with this, but we know from 3 Trees to Midnight that the Kunari are operating in the borders of the Arlathan Forest. I think this is ultimately the true purpose behind the invasion. Lastly, I want to say a bit about the Antivan Crows. The story does reveal they are under contract, which I was glad of, but I'm still a bit worried about the Antivan Crows being presented as plucky rebels against the Kunari occupation, rather than the shady guild of assassins that they are. I hope they don't soften the edges too much about that. Okay, let's get to what probably interests most of you, the in-game cinematic. Let's get a few things out of the way first. First, this is a work-in-progress cinematic, so it could still possibly change when we see it in-game. Second, I'd like to note that this sort of animated cutscene isn't new to Dragon Age. For Dragon Age Inquisition, both Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2 used similar scenes, mostly to set the stage. Both Origins and Awakening used them at the start of the game to explain the premise of the Blight and the Darkspawn infighting, respectively. Dragon Age 2 used them between the game's 3 acts to set up the conflicts for that act. This cinematic appears to be in the same mold, though the style is a little different. It really is just Varric explaining the gist of who the Dreadwolf is and what his goals are. There are 2 scenarios where I see this playing. The first is more directly following the Origins model and playing this at the beginning of the game before launching the player into the character creator. The second is to have this play whenever the Dreadwolf and his plans are explained to the players in-game. Varric does close off this video saying that we are the only ones that can stop him, but that could be addressed to the player or the in-game player character, so I don't think that's indicative. When it comes down to it, this cinematic exists to familiarize new players with the Dreadwolf and why he's someone to worry about, regardless of when it plays. Let's look at the actual content of the video. I want to preface this by saying that picking apart the minutiae of symbols isn't really my forte, and I recently watched a great video by Gil Dirthelin that really digs in deep on those symbols, so I encourage you to watch her video if you want more of that than I can provide. It starts with Varric explaining how he knew Solas as an odd apostate, but his true identity was a figure of elven myth, the Dreadwolf Fen'Harel. I do think there may be some significance to the sun behind him on the wolf's forehead. In the Dalish myth, the sun is a primal force, and because of what comes next, I think it could be associating it with the Fade somehow. Varric also tells us that the Dreadwolf is remembered as a god of lies or a heroic rebel, depending on what story you believe. Fen'Harel is usually described as a god of trickery rather than lies, though ultimately I don't think that distinction is very significant. The scene then transitions to an orb in the sky that seems to represent the Fade, with the Golden City at its center, and several half-circles filled with symbols around the edge. These have everyone talking. First, the 7 circles match up with the 7 from that old promotional image that was released years ago. At the time, we all assumed these were linked to the old gods, as there are 7 of them and 5 are dark, matching up with the 5 old gods that have risen as archdemons. However, these particular symbols in the new cinematic are almost certainly connected to the elven gods. For starters, they can be seen in Illuvians in the Trespasser DLC, and unused art assets. These symbols also appear as Varric is explaining how Fen'Harel sealed away the elven gods by creating the Veil. I won't speculate on which symbol correlates to which god myself, but I'm sure they do. Now some will say this confirms that the 7 old gods of Tevinter and the 7 elven gods that got sealed are the same, which is a theory that I think has been around for as long as Dragon Age has been a franchise. Personally, I think it definitely confirms that there is a link between them, but I'm not prepared to say that they're the same entities. There's a lot we still don't know about the Forgotten Ones, the motives of the old gods, and other gaps in our knowledge. However, the head crests of these 2 figures on a more recent piece of promotional art for Dreadwolf match up precisely with some of these symbols, so I think it confirms that the elven gods, or at least some beings associated with them, will be a more active force in Dreadwolf. Now, Varric's description of the creation of the Veil to imprison the Evanuris is coupled with imagery of the blackening of the Golden City, even though that event occurred thousands of years later. I think this may be just for brevity, but it also suggests that what the Dreadwolf set in motion may be connected to the Blight and the corruption of the city. We can't do much more than speculate about what that connection may be, however. Digging into that would require delving into a pile of obscure elven lore that I honestly shouldn't if I want to get this video out before Christmas. In the last scene, Varric explains Solas' plans to tear down the Veil, which will destroy the world, over an image of the sphere containing the Fade exploding with energy. This seems to confirm that, yes, his plan to tear down the Veil will be incredibly destructive. There is some speculation that the dagger he seems to be holding is actually the Red Lyrium idol. In one of the short stories from Tevinter Nights, there is mention of a blade extending from the base of the idol during a ritual, so I'm prepared to believe that's probably the case. What his specific plan is remains a bit obscure. Well, that's all I have to say on the cinematic for now. The elven symbols were interesting and confirm some of our speculations, but mostly it isn't anything new. We know all the big ideas here already. I actually got more out of the short story in terms of learning new things going on in Dragon Age Dreadwolf, but in any case it was interesting to see this style of cinematic. I hope this won't be the only one, and maybe there will be several like this in Dreadwolf, since I rather like it. That's the note we'll end on. Please check out my Dragon Age lore videos and subscribe if you want to keep following my Dragon Age coverage. I also have some cyberpunk and a few other assorted lore videos you may enjoy. Comment to let me know what sort of videos you'd like to see from me. Until my next video, I hope you have a great day. Happy holidays.